The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Riverside Academy as Grace Williams pushed her cleaning cart down the empty hallway. At 58, she had been walking these same corridors for nearly 15 years yet. She still marveled at the grandeur of this place. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, expensive artwork lined the walls, and everything seemed to gleam with the kind of perfection that only money could buy. Grace moved quietly, her worn sneakers making barely a sound on the spotless floor. She had learned long ago that being invisible was part of the job. The wealthy families who sent their children here paid enormous fees, and they expected the school to run like clockwork. That meant people like Grace needed to do their work. Without being seen or heard, she paused outside the music room, listening to the faint sound of a piano drifting through the heavy wooden door. Someone was practicing early, their fingers stumbling over the keys as they worked through a difficult passage. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her. Even played imperfectly, it was beautiful. "Focus, Grace," she whispered to herself, checking her watch. She had exactly 45 minutes to clean the music room before the first classes began. The students would start arriving soon, their expensive cars filling the parking lot as they prepared for another day of privilege. Grace pulled out her master key and quietly opened the door. The music room was her favorite place in the entire school. Two grand pianos sat in the center of the room, their black surfaces reflecting the morning light streaming through tall windows. Rows of chairs were arranged in perfect formation, and music stands stood at attention like soldiers waiting for orders. The early morning pianist had already left, probably one of the dedicated students who came in early to practice. Grace had seen them over the years, these young people who took their musical education for granted. They complained about lessons, grumbled about practice, and sometimes even skipped their expensive private instruction to hang out with friends. If only they knew, Grace thought as she began dusting the windowsills. If only they understood what a gift they had. She worked methodically, starting with the windows and moving toward the pianos. Every surface needed to be perfect. Mrs. Victoria Pemberton, the head of the music department, had very high standards. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything and wasn't shy about pointing out mistakes. Grace had encountered Mrs. Pemberton many times over the years, though the music teacher rarely acknowledged her presence. When she did, it was usually to complain about something. The floor wasn't clean enough, the piano bench was positioned wrong, or Grace was making too much noise while the precious students were trying to concentrate. Mrs. Pemberton came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for generations. Her great-grandfather had founded one of the city's largest banks, and she never let anyone forget it. She drove a BMW, wore designer clothes, and spoke with the kind of accent that suggested she had attended the finest schools money could buy. Grace approached the first piano carefully, her cleaning cloth soft in her weathered hands. These instruments were worth more than she made in 2 years. She dusted each key gently, remembering the countless hours she had spent at similar keyboards, in what felt like another lifetime. As she worked, she began to hum softly. It was an old habit, one that helped pass the time during the long solitary hours of cleaning. Today, the melody that came to her was Chopin, a piece she had once known by heart. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but the notes seemed to hang in the air like delicate butterflies. The second piano required the same careful attention. Grace moved around it slowly, making sure every surface was spotless. When she reached the keyboard, she paused. Her fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment, not quite touching them. She could almost feel the music waiting there, patient and eternal. "What are you doing?" Grace jumped, her heart racing as she spun around. A young man stood in the doorway, his expensive backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked to be about 17, with perfectly styled hair and clothes that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent. "I'm sorry," Grace said quickly, stepping away from the piano. I was just cleaning. I didn't touch anything." The student walked into the room, his eyes curious rather than angry. "Were you humming, Chopin?" Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. "I don't know what you mean." "That song you were humming. It was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, wasn't it?" The young man set his backpack down and looked at her with genuine interest. "My name's David. I come in early to practice sometimes." "I'm Grace," she replied, still feeling embarrassed about being caught. "I clean the music rooms." David nodded, but he didn't seem ready to drop the subject. "How do you know Chopin?" "That's pretty advanced classical music." Grace picked up her cleaning supplies, eager to change the subject. "I should let you practice. I don't want to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," David said. "I was just curious. Most people don't even know who Chopin is, let alone his individual pieces." Before Grace could respond, the sound of heels clicking on marble announced the arrival of Mrs. Pemberton. The music teacher swept into the room like a storm cloud, her expression already showing irritation. "David, you're early again," she said, barely glancing at Grace. "I've told you before that you need to sign up for practice time through the office." "Yes, ma'am," David replied. And you," Mrs. Pemberton turned to Grace with obvious annoyance. "Why are you still here? The room should have been cleaned by now." Grace felt the familiar sting of dismissal. "I'm almost finished, ma'am. Just a few more minutes." "Well, hurry up. I have important work to do, and I can't have the help cluttering up my classroom." Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of treating service workers as invisible. David looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Grace could see that he wanted to say something, but young people rarely challenge their teachers, especially at a school like Riverside Academy. "Of course, ma'am," Grace replied quietly, gathering her supplies more quickly. She had learned long ago that arguing would only make things worse. As she headed toward the door, Grace couldn't help but steal one last glance at the piano. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to sit at that bench, to let her fingers dance across the keys and fill a room with music. Those days seemed like a dream now, so distant that sometimes she wondered if they had ever been real. "Grace," David called out as she reached the door. She turned back, surprised. "Maybe we'll talk again sometime," he said with a small smile. Mrs. Pemberton looked between them with obvious displeasure. "David, please focus on your studies. You don't need to concern yourself with the staff." Grace nodded at David and slipped out of the room, her heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words and forgotten dreams. Outside in the hallway, she could hear Mrs. Pemberton beginning her lecture about proper behavior and the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries. As Grace pushed her cart toward the next classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in years, someone had seen her as more than just the invisible woman who cleaned their world. David's curiosity about the music she had been humming reminded her of a part of herself she had buried so deep she almost forgot it existed. The rest of the morning passed in its usual routine, but Grace found herself humming more often than usual. The melodies seemed to flow from some hidden place in her heart, notes that had been waiting patiently for their chance to be heard again. 3 weeks had passed since Grace's brief conversation with David in the music room. She had seen him a few more times during her morning cleaning routine, and each time he offered a friendly nod or a quiet "good morning." It was a small thing, but it brightened her days in ways she hadn't expected. On this particular Thursday afternoon, Grace was running behind schedule. Her other job at the downtown office building had kept her later than usual, and now she was rushing to finish her work at Riverside Academy before the evening activities began. She pushed her cart quickly down the hallway, hoping to clean the music room before Mrs. Pemberton's advanced class started. The music room door was slightly open when she arrived, and she could hear voices inside. Mrs. Pemberton was already there with her students, which meant Grace would have to wait. She positioned her cart quietly beside the door, planning to come back later when the room was empty. "This piece is not that difficult," Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried through the doorway, sharp with frustration. "You've been working on it for 3 weeks, and you still can't get the timing right." Grace peered through the gap in the door and saw 8 students sitting in chairs arranged in a semicircle. Their expensive instruments lay across their laps or rested on stands beside them. These were the advanced music students, the ones whose parents paid extra for private lessons and master classes. "Let's try it again from the beginning," Mrs. Pemberton continued, moving to the piano. "And this time, please try to remember what we discussed about dynamics." The students began to play, but even Grace could tell something was wrong. The melody was there, but it lacked soul. The notes were technically correct, but they felt empty, like words spoken without meaning. Mrs. Pemberton stopped them after. "Only a few measures. No, this is completely wrong. You're playing it like a math exercise, not like music." One of the students, a girl with perfectly styled blonde hair, raised her hand. "Mrs. Pemberton, maybe we need more time to practice individually." "Time?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice rose slightly. "Your parents are paying for the finest musical education money can buy, and you want more time? Professional musicians don't get more time. They get it right the first time." Grace shifted uncomfortably outside the door. She had cleaned this room countless times while Mrs. Pemberton taught, but she had never heard the teacher sound quite so frustrated. Usually, the advanced students performed well enough to keep their instructor satisfied. "Let's try something different," Mrs. Pemberton said, her tone becoming dangerously sweet. "Perhaps we need to understand what real struggle looks like. Maybe then you'll appreciate the privilege of your education." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. Something in Mrs. Pemberton's voice reminded her of a cat playing with a mouse. "You know," Mrs. Pemberton continued, walking toward the door, "I've noticed we have an audience for our lesson today." Grace's heart began to race. She tried to step back, but Mrs. Pemberton was already pulling the door open wide. "Come in, Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Don't be shy. We know you've been listening." Grace felt 8 pairs of eyes turn toward her. Some of the students looked curious, others seemed uncomfortable, but all of them were watching her with the kind of attention she had spent years trying to avoid. "Mrs. Pemberton, I was just waiting to clean the room," Grace said quietly. "I didn't mean to interrupt your class." "Oh, but you're not interrupting at all," Mrs. Pemberton replied, her voice dripping with false kindness. "In fact, I think you might be exactly what we need right now." Grace clutched her cleaning supplies tighter, sensing danger but unable to escape. "You see, students," Mrs. Pemberton addressed her class while keeping her eyes on Grace, "sometimes we don't appreciate what we have until we see what others lack. Grace here has been working at this school for years, listening to our music, watching our lessons." David, who was sitting in the back row, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Grace caught his eye for a moment and saw something like an apology there. "I'm sure Grace has absorbed quite a bit over the years," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "Haven't you, Grace?" "I just do my job, ma'am," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you do. But I bet you've picked up a thing or two about music, haven't you? All those hours of listening while you work." Grace remained silent, but Mrs. Pemberton wasn't finished. "In fact, I seem to remember hearing you humming classical pieces, quite ambitious for someone in your position." The words hit Grace like physical blows, each one designed to put her in what Mrs. Pemberton considered her proper place. One of the students, a boy named Christopher, spoke up. "Mrs. Pemberton, maybe we should just continue with our lesson." "Oh, but this is part of our lesson," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "You see, music isn't just about having expensive instruments and private tutors. It's about understanding, about feeling. And I think our friend Grace here might be able to show us something about that." Grace felt trapped. The students were watching her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Mrs. Pemberton was circling her like a predator. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear the voice of her old piano teacher from decades ago, reminding her that music belonged to everyone, not just the privileged few. "Grace," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice now loud enough for the entire room to hear, "since you seem so interested in our music, why don't you show these students how it's done?" The room fell completely silent. Grace could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do." Mrs. Pemberton gestured grandly toward the piano. "You've been listening to us for years. Surely you've learned something. Why don't you sit down and play something for us?" Grace looked at the piano, then at the students, then back at Mrs. Pemberton. She could feel the trap closing around her. If she refused, she would look foolish and confirm Mrs. Pemberton's belief that she was just the hired help who didn't belong in this world. But if she accepted the challenge, she risked exposing herself in ways she wasn't prepared for. "Mrs. Pemberton," David said, his voice stronger now. "I don't think this is David." "Please don't interrupt," Mrs. Pemberton cut him off. "This is a teachable moment. Grace, we're waiting." The other students were shifting in their seats now, clearly uncomfortable with what was happening. Some looked embarrassed. Others seemed fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. But all of them were watching Grace, waiting to see what she would do. Grace set down her cleaning supplies slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She had spent 15 years being invisible in this place. 15 years of biting her tongue and accepting disrespect because she needed the job. But something inside her was awakening, something that had been sleeping for too long. "What would you like me to play, ma'am?" Grace asked, her voice quiet but steady. Mrs. Pemberton's smile widened. She was enjoying this, confident that she was about to prove her point about knowing one's place in the world. "Oh, let's make it interesting," Mrs. Pemberton said. Walking over to a cabinet and pulling out a thick book of sheet music, she flipped through the pages dramatically before settling on one. "How about this? Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It's one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Mrs. Pemberton had chosen one of the most difficult pieces imaginable, a composition that required years of training and practice to master. It was clearly meant to be impossible, a way to humiliate Grace in front of the students and teach them all a lesson about staying in their assigned roles. "That's quite advanced," Grace said carefully. "Oh, is it too difficult?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice was mocking now. "Perhaps you'd prefer something simpler. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, perhaps?" The students were looking more uncomfortable by the minute. David had his hands clenched in his lap, and Christopher was staring at the floor. Even they could see that this had gone too far. Grace walked slowly toward the piano bench. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, but she forced herself to keep moving. She could still back down, still make an excuse and leave. But something deep inside her was refusing to run away. She sat down at the bench and adjusted it slightly, her movements automatic and practiced. Her hands rested on her knees as she looked at the keys, memories flooding back like a dam bursting open. "Well?" Mrs. Pemberton prompted. "We're all waiting to hear what you've learned from listening to us all these years." Grace placed her hands on the keyboard, feeling the smooth coolness of the keys against her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, something had changed. The frightened cleaning lady was gone, replaced by someone the students had never seen before. "Here we go," Grace said softly, and began to play. The first note filled the silence like a drop of water in a still pond. It was perfect, clear, and confident. Grace's finger had barely touched the key, yet the sound carried across the room with a purity that made everyone hold their breath. Mrs. Pemberton's smug expression began to waver. She had expected fumbling, maybe a few choppy notes that would quickly prove her point. Instead, Grace was sitting at the piano with the posture of someone who belonged there, The second note followed, then the third. Grace's hands moved across the keyboard with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who cleaned floors for a living. Her weathered fingers, usually hidden beneath rubber gloves, now danced across the keys like they were greeting old friends. David leaned forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open. He had suspected there was more to Grace than met the eye, but nothing had prepared him for this. The other students were equally transfixed, their earlier discomfort forgotten as they watched something extraordinary unfold before them. The opening passage of Chopin's Ballade began to bloom in the room. This wasn't the tentative, careful playing they had been struggling with all afternoon. This was music in its purest form, flowing from Grace's hands like water from a spring. Mrs. Pemberton took a step back, her face pale. She knew enough about piano to recognize true mastery when she heard it. The technique Grace was displaying required years of serious training, the kind of education that cost tens of thousands of dollars. Grace's eyes were closed now, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. She had forgotten about the watching students, forgotten about Mrs. Pemberton's cruel challenge, forgotten about everything except the music. For the first time in 15 years, she was truly herself again. The melody grew more complex, Grace's left hand providing a rich bass line while her right hand soared through the intricate passages that had been giving the advanced students so much trouble. She played with the kind of emotional depth that textbooks tried to teach but rarely achieved. Christopher, who had been studying piano for 8 years, felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. He had struggled with this very piece for months, and here was the school janitor playing it like it was written specifically for her hands. Other sounds began to drift in from the hallway. Teachers and staff, drawn by the extraordinary music, were gathering outside the door. Principal Anderson appeared in the doorway, his face a picture of confusion and wonder. Behind him came other faculty members, all trying to understand how such beautiful music was coming from their music room. Grace's playing became even more passionate as she moved into the heart of the piece. Her fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, creating cascades of notes that seemed to hang in the air like stars. The music told a story of longing, of dreams deferred, of beauty that refused to be silenced. Mrs. Pemberton sank into a nearby chair, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been shame. She had wanted to humiliate Grace, to put her in her place, but instead she had unleashed something magnificent. Every note Grace played was a rebuke to her assumptions, every phrase a challenge to her prejudices. The students sat in stunned silence, many of them fighting back tears. The music was reaching places in their hearts they didn't know existed. This wasn't just technical skill they were witnessing. This was a human soul expressing itself through sound. Grace's hands moved through the most challenging section of the piece, a passage that required both incredible technical ability and deep musical understanding. She played it flawlessly, her fingers never hesitating, her timing perfect. The music swelled and dipped, whispered and roared, painting pictures in the air that no words could describe. David felt ashamed of every time he had complained about his piano lessons, every moment he had taken his musical education for granted. Here was someone who clearly had extraordinary talent, someone who should have been on concert stages around the world, instead cleaning their classrooms. Because life had dealt her a different hand, the piece began to build toward its climax. Grace's playing becoming more intense, more passionate. Her whole body was involved now, leaning into the dramatic passages, pulling back for the gentle moments. She was no longer just playing Chopin, she was living it, breathing it, becoming it. Mrs. Pemberton watched with growing horror as she realized what she had done. She had tried to embarrass a woman who was clearly a gifted musician, someone whose talent surpassed her own and probably that of many professional pianists. The cruelty of her actions was becoming clear even to her. The music room had become a concert hall. More people had gathered in the doorway and spilled into the hallway. Maintenance workers, teachers, even some students from other classes had been drawn by the incredible performance. Everyone stood in respectful silence, afraid to move and break the spell. Grace approached the final section of the piece, her playing becoming more reflective, more tender. Her touch on the keys was so delicate, it seemed like she was caressing each note into existence. The melody wound its way through complex harmonies, each phrase more beautiful than the last dot as the piece neared its end. Grace's playing became softer, more intimate. She was sharing something precious with everyone in that room, something she had kept hidden for decades. The final notes hung in the air like a blessing, pure and perfect and heartbreakingly beautiful. When the last note faded into silence, nobody moved. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with the weight of what everyone had just experienced. Grace sat with her hands still on the keys, her eyes still closed, as if she was reluctant to return to the real world. Slowly, she opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were the same weathered hands that had been cleaning this room for 15 years, but somehow they looked different now. They looked like what they were, the hands of an artist. Grace turned on the bench to face the room, and for the first time she seemed to notice the crowd that had gathered. Principal Anderson was there, along with teachers she had seen but never really talked to. The custodial staff had gathered as well, their faces showing a mixture of pride and amazement. But it was the students' faces that affected her most. David had tears in his eyes. Christopher looked like he had seen a miracle. The girl who had asked for more practice time was staring at Grace with something approaching reverence. Mrs. Pemberton remained seated, her face buried in her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and her expression was one of complete devastation. She had been so certain of her superiority, so confident in her assumptions about people based on their jobs and social status. Now all of that had crumbled. Mrs. Pemberton started to speak, then stopped. What could she say? How could she explain or excuse what she had done? Grace stood up from the piano bench slowly, smoothing down her uniform. The magical moment was ending, and reality was creeping back in. She was still the janitor, still the woman who cleaned these rooms, emptied these trash cans. But something fundamental had changed, and everyone in that room knew it. The spell was broken by the sound of applause. It started with David, who began clapping slowly, his hands shaking. One by one, the others joined in until the room filled with the sound of appreciation and respect. Some people were crying, others were smiling, but everyone was clapping for Grace. She stood there in her cleaning uniform, surrounded by the music that had shaped her life, finally seen and recognized for who she truly was. The applause slowly died down, but the silence that followed felt different than before. It wasn't empty or awkward. Instead, it was filled with questions that everyone wanted to ask, but didn't know how to voice. Principal Anderson stepped forward, his face still showing amazement at what he had just witnessed. "Grace," he said gently, "I think we all need to sit down and talk." Grace nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was fading, leaving behind the reality of what had just happened. She had revealed herself in a way she had never intended, and now there would be consequences. Mrs. Pemberton remained in her chair, looking like she wanted to disappear entirely. The students were still staring at Grace with a mixture of awe and confusion. David finally spoke up, his voice soft with respect. "Grace, where did you learn to play like that?" Grace looked at him, then at all the other faces watching her. For 15 years, she had kept her past locked away, buried so deep that sometimes she almost forgot it herself. But now, standing in this room with the echo of Chopin still hanging in the air, she realized that the secret had become too heavy to carry alone. "It's a long story," she said quietly. "We have time," Principal Anderson replied, pulling up a chair. "Please, tell us." Grace sat back down on the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap. Where could she even begin? How do you explain a lifetime of dreams and sacrifices to people who had never known real struggle? I was born in Detroit, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. My mama worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, but we didn't have much. The only piano I ever saw was the old upright at our church. She paused, remembering those Sunday mornings when she would sneak into the sanctuary early, before service. Started just to touch the keys. The church pianist, Mrs. Johnson, caught me playing one day when I was 7. Instead of scolding me, she sat down and listened. Then she asked me where I had learned the song. Grace smiled at the memory. I told her I just listened and figured it out. She didn't believe me at first. She thought someone had been teaching me. But when she realized I was telling the truth, she made a decision that changed my life. The room was completely quiet now. Even Mrs. Pemberton had looked up, her face showing genuine interest despite her earlier shame. Mrs. Johnson convinced my mama to let her give me piano lessons. She didn't charge us anything, said it would be a sin to waste a gift like mine. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, I would walk to her house and she would teach me everything she knew. Grace's voice grew stronger as she continued. By the time I was 12, I was playing pieces that some adults couldn't handle. Mrs. Johnson said I had what she called natural talent, but I knew it was more than that. Music wasn't just something I could do, it was something I had to do. It was like breathing. David leaned forward, completely absorbed in her story. What happened next? Word got around about the little girl who could play piano like an angel. When I was 14, a music professor from the university heard me play at a church recital. He told my mama I belonged in a real music school, somewhere that could nurture my gift properly. Grace's eyes grew distant as she remembered that day. The professor had been so excited, talking about conservatories and competitions and concerts. To a young girl from the projects, it had sounded like a fairy tale. He helped me apply for scholarships, full scholarships. By the time I graduated high school, I had been accepted to 3 different music schools. I chose Juilliard. A collective gasp went through the room. Juilliard was a name that everyone recognized, even those who weren't musicians. It was the dream school, the place where only the most talented students in the world were accepted. I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and took a bus to New York City. I had never been out of Detroit before, never seen buildings that tall or streets that crowded. But I wasn't scared. I was excited. I was going to study music at the best school in the country. Grace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds of Riverside Academy. Those were the best 4 years of my life. I studied with professors who had performed in concert halls around the world. I learned pieces I had only dreamed of playing. I made friends who understood my passion for music. You graduated from Juilliard? Christopher asked, his voice filled with wonder. Grace shook her head sadly. No, I didn't. In my senior year, something happened that changed everything. The room seemed to hold its breath. Grace's voice became quieter, more fragile. My daughter Lisa was 22 then. She had stayed in Detroit, working and trying to save money for college. She was so proud of me, always bragging to her friends about how her mama was studying at the famous music school in New York. Grace paused, gathering strength for the hardest part of her story. It was a Tuesday night in February. I was practicing for my senior recital, the performance that would basically determine my future career. The phone rang in the practice room, and I almost didn't answer it, but something made me pick up. The silence in the room was complete now. Everyone could sense what was coming. It was the hospital in Detroit. Lisa had been in a car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car head-on. Grace's voice broke slightly. She died instantly, they said. She didn't suffer. Several of the students were crying now. David had his hand over his mouth, and even Principal Anderson's eyes were wet. But that wasn't the end of it, Grace continued. Lisa had a 3-year-old daughter, little Angela. Lisa's father had never been in the picture, and I was the only family that child had left. Grace turned back to face the room, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I had a choice to make. I could finish my degree, pursue my dreams of becoming a concert pianist, and let Angela go into foster care. Or I could leave school and raise my granddaughter myself. You left school, Mrs. Pemberton said softly. It wasn't a question. I left school, Grace confirmed. I took a bus back to Detroit, packed up Angela's things, and brought her back to New York with me. But I couldn't afford to stay in school and raise a child at the same time. So I dropped out 6 weeks before graduation. The weight of that sacrifice hung heavy in the air. 6 weeks. She had been 6 weeks away from graduating from one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. I found work wherever I could. Cleaning offices at night, working in restaurant kitchens, doing laundry. Anything that would pay enough to keep Angela fed and clothed. We moved to smaller and smaller apartments as I tried to make ends meet. What about your music? David asked. Grace smiled sadly. There was no time for music. No money for a piano. No energy left after working multiple jobs and taking care of a grieving child. Angela had nightmares for months after losing her mother. She needed me more than music did. But you never stopped loving it, Principal Anderson observed. No, Grace agreed. I never stopped loving it. Sometimes, late at night after Angela fell asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table and practice on a paper keyboard I had drawn. Just moving my fingers, remembering the feel of the keys, keeping the muscle memory alive. She walked back to the piano and touched the keys gently. Angela grew up, graduated high school, got a scholarship to college. She's studying to be a teacher now, and I'm so proud of her. But by then, I was in my 40s, and the music world had moved on without me. So you became a janitor, one of the students said, not unkindly. I became a janitor, Grace confirmed. And it's honest work. I take pride in keeping this school clean, in making sure you all have a beautiful environment to learn in. But yes, sometimes when I'm cleaning these music rooms, I remember what it felt like to dream of something different. The room was quiet, as everyone absorbed her story. 15 years of cleaning these floors, listening to other people make music, keeping her own gift hidden. It was almost too much to comprehend. The only time I play now is here, late at night when everyone's gone. Home. Sometimes I stay after my shift ends and play for a few minutes. It helps keep the sadness away. Mrs. Pemberton stood up suddenly, her face filled with anguish. Grace, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. What I did today was unforgivable. Grace looked at her with compassion rather than anger. You didn't know my story, Mrs. Pemberton. Most people see a janitor and think that's all there is to see. I'm used to it. But that doesn't make it right, Mrs. Pemberton replied, tears streaming down her face. I tried to humiliate you, and instead you showed me what real grace looks like. Grace nodded, accepting the apology with dignity. We all make mistakes. The question is what we do after we make them. In the days that followed Grace's extraordinary performance, word spread throughout Riverside Academy like wildfire. Students who hadn't been in the music room that afternoon heard the story from their classmates. Teachers whispered about it in the faculty lounge. Even the kitchen staff and maintenance crew were talking about how their colleague had revealed herself to be a world-class musician. Grace noticed the change immediately. Students who had walked past her for years without a glance now stopped to say hello. Teachers she had only seen from a distance introduced themselves properly for the first time. But the attention made her uncomfortable. She had spent so many years being invisible that suddenly being seen felt overwhelming. On Monday morning, Principal Anderson called Grace into his office. She sat nervously in the chair across from his desk, wondering if she was in trouble for what had happened in the music room. "Grace," he began, his voice warm and respectful, "I want to apologize. In all the years you've worked here, I never took the time to really get to know you. That was my failure, not yours." Grace shifted in her seat. "You don't need to apologize, sir. You've always been fair to me. Fair, maybe, but not truly welcoming. After what happened last week, I've been thinking about how we can do better." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I'd like to offer you a position teaching piano. We could create a new program, maybe offer lessons to students who can't afford private instruction." Grace was quiet for a long moment. The offer was generous, more than she had ever expected. But something in her heart wasn't ready to accept it. "That's very kind, sir, but I like my job. I take pride in keeping this school clean and beautiful. It's honest work, and I'm good at it." Principal Anderson looked surprised. "But Grace, you're clearly overqualified for janitorial work. Your talent is extraordinary." Grace smiled gently. "My talent doesn't make my current job less valuable. This school needs people to keep it running smoothly, and I'm honored to be one of those people. Music will always be part of me, but it doesn't have to be my job to be meaningful." He nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "What if we compromised? Keep your current position, but maybe teach a few students after school? Just a couple of hours a week?" Grace considered this. "I might be willing to help some students who really want to learn, but only if they come to me because they love music, not because their parents think they should." "I think we can arrange that," Principal Anderson said with a smile. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pemberton was struggling with her own reckoning. She had barely slept since the incident, replaying her cruel words over and over in her mind. She had called in sick for 2 days, unable to face her students or her colleagues. When she finally returned to school, she found a note waiting for her from Grace. It was written on simple notebook paper in careful handwriting. "Mrs. Pemberton, I hope you know that I hold no anger toward you. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to grow from them." Grace, Mrs. Pemberton read the note 3 times, tears blurring her vision. Here was a woman she had tried to humiliate, offering her forgiveness and grace. It was more than she deserved, and she knew it. That afternoon, Mrs. Pemberton sought out Grace in the hallway. "Grace, could I speak with you for a moment?" Grace stopped her cleaning and gave Mrs. Pemberton her full attention. "Of course. I've been thinking about what happened, and I need you to know something. What I did wasn't just about you. It was about me and my own insecurities. I've always been afraid that my students don't respect me, that they see through my fancy degree and expensive clothes to someone who's not as talented as she pretends to be." Grace listened without judgment, letting Mrs. Pemberton find her words. "When I saw how naturally music came to you, how effortlessly you played something my students have been struggling with for weeks, it terrified me. It threatened everything I thought I knew about who deserves to be in these spaces. Music doesn't belong to any one type of person," Grace said softly. "It belongs to anyone who loves it enough to let it live in their heart." Mrs. Pemberton nodded, wiping away tears. "I want to do better. Not just with you, but with everyone. I want to be the kind of teacher who lifts people up instead of tearing them down." "That's a good goal," Grace replied, "and I believe you can do it." As the weeks passed, the changes at Riverside Academy became more visible. Mrs. Pemberton transformed her teaching style, becoming more patient and encouraging with her students. She started each class by reminding them that music was a gift to be shared, not a competition to be won. David and several other students approached Grace about informal piano lessons. She agreed to meet with them once a week after school, in the same music room where everything had changed. These sessions became some of the most popular gatherings at the school, not because Grace was a demanding teacher, but because she taught with such obvious love for the music. "Feel the music in your heart first," she would tell her students. "Your fingers will follow where your heart leads." Christopher, who had been struggling with piano for years, finally began to improve under Grace's gentle guidance. "She doesn't just teach us notes," he told his friends. "She teaches us how to find the music inside ourselves." The transformation wasn't limited to the music department. Other teachers began to notice the support staff in new ways. The head librarian struck up conversations with the custodians who cleaned her space each evening. The art teacher learned the names of all the maintenance workers who helped set up her exhibitions. Grace continued her work as head of custodial services, but now she did it with a new sense of recognition and respect from the school community. Students would often stop to chat with her as she worked, asking about music or simply sharing stories about their day. One evening, as Grace was finishing her cleaning rounds, she found a surprise waiting in the music room. A small group of students had gathered there with their instruments, and they began to play as soon as she entered. It was a simple piece, nothing too complicated, but they played it with such heart that Grace was deeply moved. "We wanted to thank you," David explained after they finished. "You've taught us that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest." 6 months after the incident that had changed everything, Riverside Academy held its annual spring concert. This year was different, though. For the first time, the program included a special performance that wasn't part of any formal curriculum. Grace sat at the piano on the school's main stage, wearing a simple black dress instead of her usual uniform. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, parents, and community members who had heard about the remarkable janitor who could play like an angel. She had chosen to play the same Chopin piece that had started it all, but tonight it sounded different. There was no fear in it, no pain. Instead, it was filled with gratitude and hope. As she played, Grace thought about Angela, now in her final year of college and sitting proudly in the front row. She thought about all the students she had taught, and all the dreams that had led her to this moment. When the piece ended, the entire auditorium rose to their feet in thunderous applause. But Grace wasn't looking at the crowd. She was looking at Mrs. Pemberton, who was clapping with tears streaming down her face, and at Principal Anderson, who was beaming with pride, and at David and Christopher and all her students who were cheering. Like they had just witnessed a miracle. In many ways, they had. Not the miracle of a janitor who could play piano, but the miracle of a community learning to see each other's full humanity. The miracle of dignity recognized, talent celebrated, and grace offered even in the face of cruelty. Grace stood and bowed to the audience, then walked off the stage and back to her life. She had work to do in the morning, floors to clean and music rooms to prepare for another day of learning. But now she did that work as someone who was truly seen, truly valued, and truly home. The last thing she heard as she left the auditorium was Angela's voice calling out, "That's my grandmother. That's my amazing grandmother." And Grace smiled, knowing that some dreams don't die. They just wait patiently for their moment to shine.